Hello, my friends. Happy December. Happy holiday season. That is going to be the topic for today is how can we keep our money joyful during the holiday season and not let some of those common holiday stressors, especially when it comes to money, start to creep into our experiences. So, we're going to be talking about that a little bit today. And of course, I have to make a quick note of how much fun I have being Buddy the Elf every year during the Golden Chamber of Commerce Jingle on the Avenue. Super fun to do that. Although, sadly, this year, I'm not going to be able to do it because I injured my leg and it just wouldn't make sense to be hobbling around as a crutch Buddy the Elf. So if you know anybody who's able to do it, send them our way. All right, jumping into things. The topic or the schedule for today is I'll give you a brief introduction to me, and then I want to talk a little bit about holidays and money personality types, some of the main things that come up when we start to talk to young professionals all the way up to folks who have been in the workforce for many years. Some of those things that commonly come up for people around the holidays. And oftentimes those are family interactions. There are ways to approach these when it comes to our money on a very numbers-based level and tactical level that can be helpful for us. But there's also ways that we're going to talk about to simply have some more conversations, which can be really interesting around this idea of money personality types. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then I want to talk more about how to see the playing field, because really, when it comes to keeping our money joyful during this holiday season, the answer is that it is about getting really intentional with what it is that we actually want our experience of this season to look like, and then executing on the things that allow us to get there. So we'll talk about what that means a little bit more. And then throughout the entire thing, we will be sharing some ideas for the holidays that may be helpful for you. But I do want to just say here early and often, you'll hear me say this a bunch, that at the end of the day, personal finance is personal. So feel free to connect with me, book a call, and we can start to discuss some of these things as they relate to your personal scenario on a little bit more, a level with a little bit more depth, and start to really wrestle with some of the ideas and get really intentional for ourselves. Okay, with that said, jumping into things, I'll give you the introduction to me. I am the community development advocate over here at On Tap Credit Union, and we do our community development through doing quality foundational financial education in our community. I was a high school math teacher for 9 years. I started this financial literacy curriculum for my high school second semester seniors, and ultimately I realized that my goodness, we live in a capitalist society that just throws us to the wolves, financially speaking, right? We don't get any training in high school. Money tends to be a taboo thing to talk about in our society. And so we tend to really learn how to manage our money through making mistakes and correcting them over time. And so that's why eventually I realized that I wanted to be doing this type of quality foundational education on a more community-oriented level. And that's why I'm now able to do that at On Tap Credit Union. So how are we able to do it as a credit union? Well, a couple of foundational structural things that I want to highlight about credit unions. The first one is that credit unions are a not-for-profit organization. So the whole goal for us is any profits that are generated, we want to give them back to you, our member owners. And we recognize that, of course we do that through low rates on loans and through high yields on deposits. But we recognize that nobody ever built a wealthy life by saving 0.5% on an auto loan, right? Like that's the stuff that's great. Like give me those savings while I can. But we also do this foundational financial education and coaching because we recognize that the way we build our wealthy lives is by engaging in ongoing, healthy, positive, productive conversations over time and by knowing our numbers. And we believe that it is the function and role of credit unions to help to support you in really understanding those concepts. A couple of quotes here that I love that I'll highlight is just credit unions are really all about people helping people. We're not for profit, not for charity, but for service. All right. Jumping into things, I wanted to go into this next topic that I hinted at, which is this idea of money personalities. And there's a reason that I want to bring this up around the holidays specifically, because it can potentially be one of the pathways through which we can begin to understand our family members and ourselves and engage in conversations that perhaps help us to take some of those financial stresses out of some of those conversations that can sometimes be contentious. Okay, so with that said, let's jump into this first by giving you a 30,000 foot view of what are we talking about when we start to understand some of these money personalities. Well, it's really important to say right off the bat that all of these money personalities are wrong in some senses, right? These can be thought of as being very similar to some of the broad scale personality tests that you might see out there in the world. So you may have heard of a Myers-Briggs personality assessment or a DISC personality test, or the Enneagram is a popular one. The Kolbe comes up, or the Working Genius comes up when it comes to teams and how do we function together as teams. Well, the thing about all of these personality type tests is that we know that at the end of the day, they are all wrong, right? Like none of these things are going to be able to capture the complexity that is us as human beings. And yet, just because all of these tests are quote wrong does not mean that they are not useful, right? They can really help us to think about the ways in which we engage and interact in the world in a way that we can begin to understand patterns better. Or maybe it gives us the language to talk about some of the natural tendencies that we have with other people. And then we can determine how we can best utilize them when working in groups with those other people. Or maybe we understand other people's strengths, whatever the case is, right? So all of these tests are not necessarily capturing us human beings and all of our complexity perfectly, but they are giving us these useful frameworks through which we can understand our world better, right? So it's important to note that when we start to talk about these money personalities as it comes to having some of these understandings within our family about how we approach money. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how we approach money and then get into these money personality types. But before I do, I did just want to make a quick note on some of these personality types in general. I mentioned one of them, the last one that I mentioned was called the Working Genius Assessment. The thing that I find to be so cool about this assessment in particular is that really what it is looking to do is show us that no one individual on our own can be perfectly, good at whether it's managing money or managing a company or whatever it is. We all have certain things that we excel at and that we thrive at and that we get energy from naturally. And then we also all have things that maybe take energy away from us a little bit more. And the way that the Working Genius breaks this out, I'm not going to go into all the details, but you can kind of see that, some people may be really great at the early ideation stages, the wonder stage or the invention stage, where as another person might have tenacity to really want to finish a project out. But they're not as good at maybe ideating early on. They more so want to be told what are the metrics for success, and they're going to finish them out through towards the end. And basically the reason why all of this working genius stuff is valuable is because when we begin to have these conversations, we begin to understand the people that we are working with and talking to a little bit better. And so this is that same concept that I want to bring to the discussion of money personality types, because I think that oftentimes when it comes to our own family members, sometimes we get into disagreements and arguments even, or maybe we just have somebody rub us the wrong way and are sort of bitter about an interaction that we had and don't really bring it up. But these things can happen sometimes simply because of a misunderstanding of the way that our family members are, and the ability to really welcome that way of being into the world and also to celebrate it for all of the positives that it has. And so that is really the hope and the goal with beginning to understand some of these different money personality types. So with that said, let's jump into it just a little bit and talk about some of these on a very basic level. Now, what these money personality types are is these come from a particular author named Olivia Mellon, who wrote about a couple, four actually particular personality types. And I think that they're somewhat representative of that. Basically, before I go into it, there are a lot of different money personality types that have been written about. And so this is not going to be representative of every single one out there. Again, it's just a framework that we can use. So there's no official money personality types. And Dr. Brad Klons wrote a lot about different money personality types and specifically invisible scripts that we hear. So I'm going to talk more about Dr. Brad Klons later on, but I just wanted to highlight that right now, 4 of these particular types come from the author Olivia Mellon, and then a few of them come from other particular financial writers out there, including myself, actually, in the financial world. So take these with a grain of salt, but basically wanted to begin talking about some of these particular personality types. And the first one is this idea of the saver. Right? Now, before I go into too many details of the saver, you can see that over here on the other side of the page, there's the spender. And so those could kind of be seen as, diametrical opposites or something like that. Before I get too down the rabbit hole of describing the specific types here, the thing that I just want to say first of all is when it comes to money personalities, we all come to money from a different perspective. Right? And it's not just did I grow up without any money. Of course, I would see it from a different angle than if I had grown up with an overabundance of money. Of course, I'll see it differently. But it's not just where did I grow up along the spectrum of income that creates some of my money personality type, right? It's two things. It's what I'm born with, my personality type naturally, and the experiences that I go through might be accurate also, that I go through growing up. And that's really what creates some of these types, right? And so I could have been anywhere along the spectrum of income, and I could still see money being the root of all evil, right? Like the thing that makes corporations do unethical things. And if I believe that, whether I knew it or not, that I actually believed that, do you think I'm going to handle my money differently than if I had maybe grown up in an entrepreneurial family and I saw money as being the value exchange that I get when I do good in the world? Yeah, right? That's a completely different perspective on money than the entrepreneurial framework of it's the value exchange that I get when I do good in my world. Of course, I'm going to handle my money differently if I believe one of those two things than if I believe the other, right? And so this is the foundation of where some of these personality traits can come from. So when we start to talk about the personality type of the saver, well, savers, probably obviously, they tend to focus on building wealth and more specifically, security. Because savers tend to be really focused on seeing money as a form of protection rather than as a form of luxury. And there are a lot of reasons for why a saver might have developed that particular personality type or that outlook on money. However, in general, when it comes to tips for savers, what I tend to recommend is to use the cash flow plan that we are going to dive into a little bit later in order to see the playing field and allow yourself to have some occasional planned indulgences because you know exactly what your guilt-free spending number is. We'll get to that in just a moment. It starts to be pretty darn fun. Okay, now let's talk briefly about the spender, who I mentioned might be seen as the opposite of the saver. Well, spenders find joy in purchasing, and they can even use shopping as emotional therapy. So oftentimes spenders will not want to track spending. Often we'll have multiple credit cards. Oftentimes there will be a lot of stuff that they have. And so in terms of tips for spenders, well, one of the things that is a huge benefit to being a spender is you're really fun. Like, sometimes savers can be seen among friend groups or among families as being the frugal one, or even like the grumpy one, the one that doesn't want to, go out and do anything and blah, blah, blah. And that can become something that can be a contentious conversation to be had. But on the flip side, tips for the saver or the spenders, you want to get out and use money to create more joy in your life naturally. It's just that sometimes it can go into the realm of overspending, right? And so really the goal for spenders as well as for savers is to be able to use the cash flow plan in a way that allows you to know exactly how many dollars you have to go and spend guilt-free on the things that you truly value. And you also know that you're putting away savings, you're putting away investments, because part of the cash flow plan is inherently knowing your numbers on things like savings rate, even though it doesn't take a ton of time to fill out this plan. Okay, I'm going to go through the other ones a little bit more quickly and not go into as much depth, just so that we can move on to the next slide here. But another couple of types are the avoider or the worrier. Now, these can sometimes have some overlap with the donor. So oftentimes the backgrounds of these folks will be, and let me just say quickly on the avoider front, that oftentimes people will be in one of two camps with money. They'll either try to avoid it completely, it'll just work itself out, it always has, or they will overcomplicate it and have a spreadsheet with 17 different tabs and too many variables, and we don't know what is actually important and what are the big levers that we can pull to make big changes and big differences in living the lives that we want to live. And so that is a type that, again, we will come back to, but this type will come up again in the dynamics that we talk about in just a moment. Worrier, avoiders, donors can all overlap a little bit. The key characteristic difference is that oftentimes donors will be people who they get active joy in giving away money for good causes. Or sometimes a donor may even enjoy giving away money even though they don't discriminate on what type of a cause it is. It's because there's something in them that says money, that's what makes people, again, back to that idea of going evil. And they want to give it away so that they don't become one of those people who has lots of money. Now, the important thing to note as I begin to wrap up talking about these different money personality types is that you may have noticed a couple of tendencies that resonate with you from these. But what you likely noticed is that you see multiple characteristics that resonate with your personality across this spectrum here. The one that I didn't talk about, the entrepreneur, is the person who continues to innovate and overcome problems because they are motivated to typically either to put value out into the world because they have a vision for something that makes the world better, and they build the business based off of that vision, starting a movement and getting out there into the world. Or they have a strong desire to bring in more and more money. Both of those can be really powerful. There's huge advantages to both of them. And sometimes being able to have discussions around these personality types can be really cool, even among family members, even during the holidays. So that's why I give you some background here. We'll talk a little bit more in a bit about how to begin having some of these conversations. And for right now, what I want to talk about is the idea of money dynamics. Now, these couple of slides, the next couple of slides, come really from the work of Ramit Sethi, who is another financial educator, advocate out there in the world. When it comes to dynamics, what he likes to talk about is the fact that dynamics are another layer that sometimes we don't think about that would get embedded on top of our own unique money personalities. And so what I mean by that is a money dynamic is how our unique money personality, our habits around money, our habitudes, our attitudes plus habits around money, how do those express themselves in the world in a way that interacts with another person who's also dealing with money? That's a money dynamic, right? When we have two or more people that are interacting with money in ways that impact and affect each other. Right? And the important thing to note here is that dynamics are always co-created. But it's also important, meaning that two people create the dynamics. It's never one person who's creating a dynamic when it comes to money. But it's also important to remember that they can be created by our cultural beliefs as well, right? And our cultural beliefs run deep. And so this is something that we may want to just have an awareness of going into the holidays, especially if we are in a family that is multicultural or even, simply multi-generational. Sometimes the cultural beliefs that we have between generations or between cultures may have a mismatch. And one of the best things we can do in this regard is to get curious and to ask questions that really help us to understand the perspectives of the other people in our families. I'm not going to go too far down what each of these particular money dynamics is. However, the thing that I do want to just mention is during the holiday season, these two dynamics, the avoider and the chaser, and the dreamer and the dream crusher, are ones that could be worth thinking about for couples, because sometimes our holiday money dynamics, maybe even stress, come from a place of the dynamic being one person wants to avoid money and the other person ends up being almost the parent in the relationship and having to chase the other spouse around over and over again to get them to have, set up their investments or to whatever it is that's going on in the money dynamic, or just to know what their expenses are, to know what their numbers are, or even to just simply help in the planning of a future vacation, right? This dynamic can come up in a slightly different way as well with the dynamic of the dreamer and the dream crusher. Not without going too far down the details of those particular dynamics. The reason that I bring it up is because around the holiday season, sometimes what happens in both of these dynamics is that one person kind of feels like the parent and they want the partner to do something. But what can happen in the communication breakdown is that sometimes the partner, the avoider, thinks that one thing is X, Y, or Z, which is impossible. Maybe it's make double the amount of money or 10 times the amount of money that they make currently, and that feels impossible. And so they continue to avoid and go forth as they normally do. When it turns out that your partner, the chaser, what is really happening is sometimes they feel like they're the parent in the relationship and all they want is some partnership. Let's sit down together and really discuss this and do this together and come to a decision that works for both of us. Because the avoider will say, no, you're the one who's good at money. You can just do that. But the person, sometimes they don't even feel like they're actually that good at money. And sometimes they do feel like they're good at money, but they still want you to be a part of the conversation, right? And so I bring this up just because talk about a really fantastic, act during the holidays would be, if you notice that you're in that dynamic, start working towards bettering it. And one of the ways that you can do that is to let's dive into a further deeper conversation, do some financial coaching, financial counseling sessions. My booking link is freely available online, and it'll also be in the last slide of this webinar presentation. All right. Wanted to talk briefly about the money lenses and money dials. And I'm going to skip through this pretty darn quick because I want to get to a couple of examples looking at the spreadsheet. And I've talked about this in prior webinars. So go back, check out some of this from a previous webinar if you're curious. But basically the short version of this is that when we get really clear about our money lenses, the ways through which we're making our money decisions, are we basing our decision off of only cost? Or is this a time where convenience or delight, especially during the holidays, may be a better money lens for me to use to value whether I want to make this purchase or not? That can be very valuable for us in getting really intentional with our holiday spending and our holiday activities. And the same is true for the second idea of money dials. This is the stuff that lights us up when it comes to money. And again, this is an idea that comes from Ramit Sethi, and I find to be fantastic for helping us to get really intentional with what it is that we want, especially around the holidays. So one of the big things that comes up when it comes to the holiday season is this idea of travel. Now, for some people, travel is a money dial. It lights you up, and that might be international travel to a new place, or it is seeing family because you live in a different part of the country now. And that's the example that I want to bring up specifically because it just feels like it has relevance to a lot of the people that I talk to, is this idea of using holiday funds for travel to see the family, whether that's flying to see family, whether it's packing up the car and driving across the country to see family, whatever the case is, it feels like this comes up often as an issue for families where, maybe their kids live in the same area, and that's great. Everything works out fine. But we have moved into a time where so many people live further from their hometown than they might have at one time. And let's be real. Holiday travel can be expensive and it can simply be stressful. It can be anti-convenient, let's call it. And so this can come up as a tension point for families where it's expected year over year that the kids who may have their own kids now as well, let's say they're 30 or 40 or 45, they may have a family, they may not, but it is expected that they would travel to see their parents every single year. And the reason I bring this up is just because it can be one of those conversations that has some tension associated with it. And what I want to suggest is that the steps that we'll go through looking at our cash flow system in just a moment will help us to figure out the vastly important question of, can we afford this? Can we afford this travel as a family? And then the reason that I wanted to bring up this concept of money dials is because for some people, again, travel is exciting. And for some people, that travel is draining. And instead, what they really care about is maybe connection and relationships, or maybe it's generosity. Or experiences, whatever the case is. So these are some of the things that I want you to be thinking about this holiday season. One more kind of side note that I want to talk about before we continue this example of travel and how do we have some of those conversations with family members is that. Actually, you know what? Let me just say this real quick, and then it will come back up again later, but. I'll say it right now, is on the front of travel, one potential option, and I just want you to encourage you, give you ideas throughout this, to get creative with how you want the holidays to look. Is, let's say that I am about my age. I'm 36 years old. I have a kid or two kids, and my family is deciding whether we're going to go travel to see my parents or not for the holidays. Well, one of the things that comes up is if I decide that it will stretch our holiday budgets and I do not get energy from the travel itself. I do get energy from connecting with my family members, but the travel is just draining, and I decide that it's going to stretch our finances too much. One of the things that could be an alternative option to look into is, the idea of these Zoom games is kind of incredible to me. And so the story that I'll tell very quickly from that front is, of course, many of us experienced connecting in different ways after the pandemic. For me, this idea of doing Zoom games with my parents, who are 70 and 66. They were able to adapt to figure out how to learn to play some of these Zoom games. There's all sorts of games available on the internet that can go for various age ranges, old folks, young kids, families that don't mind getting a little fun with each other and, poking fun back and forth, whatever it is. And so we utilized one of these online gaming services. We did a Zoom call for 40 minutes between us. We just used the free version, but we would do that once a week with my family and extended family. And we've started to do that also for some of our holiday travel when it just is too much for us to be able to make it out for the actual holiday itself, because I do value connection relationships, as do my folks. And so it's been really cool, even though it's a totally different thing. I just want to throw that out as an alternative idea that many families can start to practice and to experiment with, maybe, if it turns out that holiday travel is not in the cards for you and your family this particular year. Okay. One more thing that I will say about this before we move on is I started to make this point about health and fitness, about money dials in general, is just this idea of what lights us up. Well, this can be a really interesting and creative way to think about some of the gifts that if we do want to buy physical gifts for some of our family members or relatives, this can be an interesting framework to think about it. Maybe they are what they really love is health and fitness, and maybe we can create something that's simply a more convenient, right? Combine a couple of money dials and money lenses here, a more convenient way for them to experience their health and fitness. Like, maybe that's what it is. And we can come up with a way that we could do that, that fits within our cash flow system, our cash flow plan, and that works for us and really lights them up. Like, what are the options in that regard? But the other piece to this is that maybe we don't need to give physical gifts either. There was a Lingo Kids survey that came out last year that said that more than half of parents say they feel overwhelmed by the volume of clutter after the holidays, and that 60% of toys were broken or forgotten within 3 months. And so, there also societally feels like there is a bit of a societal movement towards more meaningful connections. And the essence of gift giving is evolving. That it's no longer just about the tangible, it's also about the memorable. And I'm curious, do you all feel that way? Drop a comment in the YouTube video below. Let us know what you think and how are you approaching the holidays this year. Okay, with that said, that's all I'm going to say about money dials. I keep wanting to go through each of these quickly, and then there's just so many good things to talk about. Here's where I wanted to introduce this idea to you of potentially having some interesting money conversations with family members. And I talked about what our perspective on money is, right? We all come to money from a different perspective. But this idea of getting really curious about our family members and starting to ask them about, what are some of the ways that they grew up around money can be really cool. And it can also be a challenge. And you may need to ask some really safe questions that allow you to begin the conversations until you feel like you've gotten to a level of competence with asking the questions that you're like, all right, this is cool, this is interesting, and I'm not, opening up any dangerous topics. The questions that you may consider asking is maybe you give a background of how you've been thinking about how all people come to money from a different perspective, and you've just seen a few things. Give a little bit of a background, and then you ask people, what was money like for them growing up? Like, what do they remember about it? Are there any phrases that their parents would say over and over again? Wow, interesting. Like, what do you think that phrase meant? What do you think that phrase meant to you? Like, what did you take away from that phrase? Being really curious in this way can open up some really interesting questions. And then you can also see, of course, the second question listed was, what are the first three words that come to mind when you think about money? And the ways in which people answer can open up really interesting topics of conversation from the perspective of, maybe one person sees money as being really a source of safety and security. And maybe another person sees money as being stressful, but another person sees money as being all about fun and future and possibility, right? And so those can be some interesting conversations that can allow us to start to break down some of these societal barriers that don't allow us to talk about our money. One other potential topic of conversation that I would throw out there for some of you families that like sports a little bit more is there is a really great potential conversation topic about athletes. And so specifically, when you start thinking about pro athletes, NFL, specifically football is kind of, this time of the year, a lot of people are thinking about football. And so, when you think about that, there are some interesting money psychology dynamics that come up when you get to the pro level. But one of the things that comes up is that is the population that is most likely to be targeted for financial scams, essentially. And so there was a recent article that I saw of somebody in Denver who was arrested for, basically scamming X number of professional athletes out of X amount of money. And so basically the reason that I bring this up is because I find this to be a really interesting conversation, especially from the perspective of college athletes, right? There's all this hubbub around college athletes and NIL, the name and likeness, and the fact that college athletes can generate income now through that name and likeness rule changing. And yet we do not provide them with very much financial education, whether it's not getting tricked by financial scams or whether it's just simple money management tactics. And so what do you think? Like, what do your family members think about that? Like, how is this all going to shake out? It can just be a really interesting conversation and topic for some people, especially if you do a little background research and you know what your family members like. See how it goes and let me know. And let's have a conversation afterwards also, because I'm always curious about these things. Okay. I said I would mention Dr. Brad Klons. I'm going to skip through this pretty darn quickly just because it is simply this idea that we all grow up hearing different things about money, and that impacts and influences the ways in which we interact with our money in the modern world, right? If we grew up hearing over and over again, money changes people, then we might be the type of person who during the holidays, we don't even want more stuff. We just simply, we don't want more money because we don't want to be one of those people, right? And instead, we simply want to connect with a family member or whatever the case is, right? Being curious and understanding some of these things can be really helpful in some of the interactions that we begin having with those same family members around the holidays. Okay, now I wanted to mention this before we talk about the numbers themselves, because I always have to mention that when it comes to budgeting, we always recommend and our system, you will see, reflects this, that we begin to live by a vision of the future rather than the memory of the past when it comes to budgeting. And what that means is I don't want to go to and at the end of the month, pull my statements for every single account and start reviewing them line by line. I want to live by a percentage-based, future-oriented system. And what that system looks like is this. The cash flow system says that we are going to try to get 50 to 60% of our take-home pay to go towards our living expenses. If we're above that, fine. It gives us some goalposts for getting to that below that 60% number. And maybe we're at 74% right now. That's fine. That allows us to know where we're at. We can begin to make decisions for this holiday season in terms of what can we actually afford. And then we can also begin to plan for future holiday seasons as to how we will change our personal financial realities to have the holiday season experience that we want every single year. The second thing on our list, second category, is we're going to try to let 5 to 10% of our take-home pay go to savings. That's for more short-term goals, and we're going to try to let 10% go towards investments, which is more for our long-term goals. That's the stuff that we're thinking about retirement for, and that can be hard for us to get excited about in the near term, and that's why we automate it. And then lastly, you'll see our guilt-free spending number. That is another term that I borrowed from Ramit Sethi, but it is so accurate, right? This could also be called what I used to call it, the fun and BS account. But this guilt-free spending term is just so relevant to our lives, right? Because I mentioned it before, how many of us feel guilty when we spend on ourselves, right? And there's all sorts of reasons and money personalities and dynamics as to why we might feel that way. But essentially what knowing our guilt-free spending number does for us is it allows us to automatically contribute that amount every single month into our guilt-free spending account. And then we can go forward in the month tracking it and kind of knowing where we're at. But the goal is to ultimately to kind of get to a place where we can operate by feel. And we don't have to track every single expense because we do have a feel for how our cash flow works, and we can be more intuitive about our money management. That's the long-term goal here. Now, in terms of how does this actually look on the down to earth? Well, let me now take a moment to close out of this, and I'm going to just make sure, all right, looks like you can still see my cash flow spreadsheet here. And I wanted to dive into a couple of examples. So what you'll see on the cash flow spreadsheet is, of course, we all know we see the income and the net income. This is the gross and the net income at the top. And then we can quickly get a gauge of how we're doing in terms of our goalpost measures. So we can see here that this example person makes $5,000 a month. That's $60K of income a year. Well, their living expenses are at 76%. So that's a little higher than our recommended 50 to 60%. I'm guessing that this person is going to be feeling a little stressed about their money, and that's fine. We know our numbers now, so we can go forth with this holiday actually knowing where we can operate and not digging ourselves in a deeper hole and then, never being able to overcome it. Now, with that said, let's go ahead and scroll down the list and see a little bit more, with a little bit more depth, what we might be able to do for this particular person. Well, as we can see, okay, I'm not going to go in and mess too much with their living expenses right now. Maybe there's some things that they could cut, maybe not. That's really where we do one-on-one coaching. Feel free to book me for a session, and we get really intentional with what it is that we want in our lives. And we can play around with, okay, would doing this cut or that cut actually work for us? And we can go and see what effect it would have on our lives. But instead, I'm going to skip over that for right now. I'm going to come down and see that this person is investing. They have a 401k, and they're also saving. They have $150 a month going towards their long-term emergency reserve. That's fantastic, because that long-term emergency reserve can be the difference between going into collections or not, right? Let's say that somebody loses their job and they have 6 months of living expenses in reserve. Well, they got 6 months before they need to find that next job. And if they had bills due that could have gone into collecting interest from a credit card, and then maybe went late enough that they went into collections, that changes people's lives really badly, right? Whereas just having that 6 months of reserves provides us with the buffer where we can get through to the other side. So I think that's a great idea for this person. What I don't see is they are not contributing to a holiday account for gifts or travel at the end of this year. So this is someplace where they may want to adjust a few things and see, are they able to really utilize this in an effective manner? And so then we can see that, again, this person makes $60K a year. Down here, their guilt-free spending is only at 16%, $626 a year. However, I'm guessing this person is young, and so my guess is that they're going to focus on getting their living expenses down over time by allowing their income to continue to increase, and that will provide them with more guilt-free spending money and potentially with more money that they can put into their savings accounts here and be able to let those fill up for various goals that they might have. Now, I wanted to give that example simply to now be able to adjust a few measures within this. So, there's a bunch of different examples that I have down here. This is a couple that makes 60K each. This is a person who makes 80K of income. This is a couple that makes 170K together. Here's a person that makes 100K. And then there's also a very high earner couple. We can go through examples of couples that are more similar to you or just your own numbers on an individual coaching call if you'd like to. But for now, here's how you're thinking about manipulating things is, let's say that this person who's making 60K a year, they really value traveling home for the holidays. They also would like to get gifts for the family, but that's going to be a second priority to traveling home because they really value that in-person connection with their family. Well, how much is it going to cost for them to travel home for the holidays? Well, of course, we're going to have to do a little bit of estimation here, but let's just come up with a few numbers and see what would work. Well, first of all, I'm just going to say, what if this person was to put $75 a month into a gift savings fund? Well, notice that $75, their guilt-free spending dropped. They're now only at $550 a month and 14%, whereas previously they were at 16%. But they really value being able to go home for the holidays. So is this going to do the trick for them? Potentially. Think about it, $75 a month. Well, 75 times 12 months gives us $900 at the end of the year in that December timeframe to either have flights for the holidays to see family, or maybe I have flights plus a few gifts here and there for my family members. But I know exactly what this does to my numbers. And so I can go ahead and spend that because the guilt-free spending number, yes, went down a little bit. I'll have to make some adjustments, but everything else there looks good. And from there, I can automate everything and move on. That's the only example that I'm going to give you because at the end of the day, a lot of these other examples, the numbers change, but the examples end up being very similar. So I'm going to flip back over to our previous presentation here, bring this back into full screen mode, and just close out this webinar presentation by, first of all, showing you how the cash flow account system setup works. So I had mentioned this briefly that really when you have your guilt-free spending number, what you're able to do is you automatically deposit that amount into a separate guilt-free checking account. And that's where you're able to track the money that you're spending just for you and separate it out from the rest of your living expenses. You over time get the feel of the cash flow here. And there's a few other tools like this calendar planning tool that can be helpful there as well. So I'll just briefly mention that. But the big thing that I want to encourage you to do is twofold. One is just a piece of knowledge, and it's knowing that in these regards, getting started is more important than becoming an expert. This is going to be something that over the years, as you continue to put your system in place, to put these bumper lanes in place for your finances, you develop that intuitive flow of things, and you're able to ultimately design the life that you have designed for yourself rather than simply, trying to figure it out again every single year. And that is powerful. So I want to encourage you to dive in and to begin to develop that competence, which ultimately leads to a confidence that is hard to beat when you're cruising through this life that you've designed. And the second thing that I want you to do along with get started is to potentially check out one of these 3 resources. So the 3 resources are, first of all, I have a favor for you. This scan code in the middle goes to a survey. I am continuing to collect feedback on this type of information. So please feel free to go over to that survey, check it out, and give your thoughts. If you found this helpful, I would love to hear about it. If you didn't like any components, would love to hear about that also, and we can see what would be helpful to adjust and make more specific to you. And then secondly, feel free to either book an appointment at the QR code on the left. That goes to a 30 or 60 minute booking site that we can have a personalized one-on-one conversation and see how this information might be relevant and fit into your holiday plans for both this year and for future holidays, so we can begin planning for those. And the second resource for you is, if you're not ready to hop on a call and start doing a one-on-one conversation that I think can be extremely helpful, then at least go and download my free PDF guide resource. It is the QR code on the right. It is called the Top 5 Money Hacks. Really, it is meant to be the shortest pathways to start developing your relationship with money management and making it more joyful overall. Thank you all for tuning into this. I hope that you're able to apply a few of these techniques and strategies during your holiday season this year. And I hope that we are able to chat, whether it's on a one-on-one coaching session, a group presentation, or simply out and about in the community in Golden, Colorado, or Arvada, Colorado, or the greater Denver metro area sometime in the future. If you're not connected with me on LinkedIn, find me right now, Marshall M. Moore. Let's connect and continue this conversation from there. Other than that, have a great holiday, everyone, and we'll talk to you soon.